event, as I mentioned, is really a celebration as well. We're finishing this project, a Healthy Soils project at JSM Organics, and this project was led by Pam Crone and Javier, as well as Laura and Arlene, other group members, that participated on this event, and it was very collaborative. And a lot great work was achieved through this, and so we're excited to be presenting that work here. And a little bit of an introduction to who we're going to be hearing from today. We're going to be hearing from Javier, who is the grower and owner of JSM Organics, and he grows organic fruit, vegetables, and flowers on a 200-acre ranch in Monterey County. And of course, it's really important to acknowledge that 120 acres of that ranch are part of a conservation easement. So as we listen and hear about this project, we really want to take in that holistic view and take into consideration that the project that we implemented here has many benefits, and not only does it benefit the grower, as Javier will talk about later today, but also benefits the ocean and marine health as well. So the second speaker that we're going to be hearing from is Pam Crone. And Pam Crone works in the Agriculture Water Quality Department with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, as well as with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And Laura will be guiding Javier through some questions, and Laura works for the Resource Conservation District in Monterey County. So thank you all for speaking at this event. And before we get started or continuing on with the speakers, I'll just sort of briefly cover healthy soils and why these are so important. So healthy soils serve to fill the needs of many organisms. They help sustain plants, they help sustain animals, and they help with humans. But in addition to that, they help regulate water, they help sustain plant and animal life, and they help buffer out potential pollutants, as well as cycle some of the nutrients. And so we'll be hearing more about the different benefits that a healthy soils could bring into your farm or into your practice. And again, focusing on that effort that it's multi-beneficial, that it could benefit the grower, it could benefit your soils, but it could also benefit our neighbor, the ocean. So with that, I'll pass it over to the next speaker, Javier, who'll be talking more about this project alongside Laura.
Thank you, Yasmin. Well, welcome everyone. It's truly an honor to participate with such a small group of smart people that can done some beautiful data collecting on what we do, hoping to share some of these practices that we do regularly to improve our soil health. Really quickly, JSM Organics, it's the name of my farm, and we started it 10 years ago. And one of our main goals has always been keeping the soil in good shape and trying to make it better than what we actually took it on when we first started farming these pieces of land. And for that, we do a bunch of different things that we'll be talking about it. But Jasmine touched a little bit about the ranch where these practices took place with the help of Laura and Pam. And we have seen incredible benefits. The number one is just the increase of organic matter in 3 years that has just blown people's minds. And sometimes it has even made me think that, is it really true that those numbers are accurate? And indeed, they are accurate, because I'm not the one taking the sample, and it's Laura and Pam and taking those soils to be analyzed at the laboratory. So the Triple M ranch, it's a 200-acre ranch, but 120 is part of a conservation easement. There it is. So I am surrounded by Mother Nature and riparian areas. So it's a very unique place, and we're really blessed that we have access to the land, because we're working with Mother Nature. I know there is a lots of issues sometimes, and people think that food safety, it's a big issue when you are dealing with Mother Nature and riparian areas. But I can tell you that in my case, I have seen no problems at all if you let the riparian areas and Mother Nature alone, and you don't really go in there. You just keep the ranch clean, you organize things, and you keep an environment that balances the the uh, the area where we keep producing food and we keep growing, planting crops. So I know it's a little different than some ranches, and some people think differently, but in my case, I have learned how to work with Mother Nature and how to produce food within Mother Nature around me. Creating soils that are healthy. I mean, some of the stuff that we did here, or what this does. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I mean, Laura and Pam will talk more about this. But I mean, when you pay attention to what you're trying to achieve and what healthy soil does by farming in a way that certain practices take place regularly, you have, you maximize uh, roots, you rotate crops, and that normally increases a, a soil environment that stays healthy. And I'm gonna talk about why rotating keeps a soil really healthy. In our area, we rely on soils that are free of verticillium because we plant strawberries. So we are organic, and we really don't fumigate, and we don't apply any chemicals to the soil, nor do we want to do that. So we do our very best to rotate different families of crops that will minimize the amount or the percentage of verticillium that stays in the soil. And for that, we rely heavily on planting different families, from brassicas to alliums to you name it. So diversity has an incredible role when it comes to the way we farm. We also have around the farm, you saw the map that they showed earlier, we have hedgerows, we intercrop. Uh, I can tell you that on a big field where we some of these practices took place, uh, at times I had 20 different crops within the same 20-acre plot, from lettuce, like romaine lettuce, green lettuce, Brussels sprouts, squash, green beans, corn, cauliflower, cilantro, tomatillos, and I'm probably forgetting a few more, but it looks just beautiful, and that also helps you uh, not only utilize your soil, I mean the area of land at its most potential, but it also helps you uh, mitigate some of those soil-borne diseases. And once we finish the season, we normally would apply compost and plant a cover crop uh, for winter time during the rainy season. So we also make sure that the soil is not never left bare with no plants growing on it. Another practice that we do, we normally when we disc the land, we really don't go really deep. There's a cover crop right there. Um, we we try tilling the land uh, no more than 24 to 30 inches, unless we're gonna be planting strawberries. But if we're gonna be planting strawberries, we would just rip the soil, every 4 years. Uh, but everything else, we do, minimum tillage, and that helps kind of keep some of the organic matter content in better, it would last longer, and it would help us as a buffer when we are watering, when we are applying fertilizers. They normally stay there longer, and it retains the water longer as well. And obviously, it helps as a, sometimes depending on what cover crop we use, it helps us as a nutrient provider. Next slide. We have another one. Oh, there you go. So there's when it comes to our land, there's always something planted, from, you know, a diversified amount of crops to when the time, when winter time comes along, we make sure that we till in the land a little bit, and then we do the cover crop, always making sure that the seeds get spread on the field before the first rain, just before the first rain, just to make sure that we take advantage of Mother Nature, the water that we would get. And that way it gets established really, really early on. So this little slide shows the cover crop that we grew. I think it was 2 years ago, and it was Merced rye, and it was just beautiful. This last year, we also planted Merced rye, and it grew a little over 6 feet high. It was really, really incredible how tall it got, and the amount of organic matter and the biomass that you're incorporating into the soil shows when you plant your crops, and it increases the yields, and also provides some of the benefits that I talked a little bit ago. There you go. So you can see what we have. We have an owl box. Well, actually, this is for birds. We have owl boxes around the field. We have a hedge row next to the riparian area and the creek. And then you can see how we intercrop. I believe I can see beefsteak tomatoes there. I can see Romanesco. And then I know we had cherry tomatoes and tomatillos. And so that's just a little snapshot of the 12-acre field. I'm sure there's some other pictures that I don't know if they are part of this slideshow, but you can see that the diversification and how diversified this field looked when it was fully planted. Like I was saying, we try to minimize on how much we disturb our soil. Again, unless it's the third or fourth year that we're gonna utilize a piece of land to do strawberries, and then we go a little deeper. Because strawberries, we need to make sure that the beds are shaped really high, so they don't get flooded when it rains, and it's easier for our workers to pick the berries during the season. So we first, we have cover crop, and we mow the whatever it is, whether it's a legume mix or grass. In this case, we planted Merced right on this field. We mow it, and then we disc lightly, and then we shape. When we shape the beds, you can see that we don't really pulverize the soil. The reason why I don't pulverize the soil is because there is no need to do that. The plants are small and the roots are really small. And as long as you have enough loose soil around, I'm talking about the transplants, they will establish really well. And so when you pulverize the soil, it's probably a lot easier to plant, but you are actually burning a lot of that organic matter that you built throughout the years. And to me, why do you want to increase the organic matter and then go right at it and burn it when you are disking 10 passes on, 12 different times going over the same piece of land to make sure you have this, really pulverized soil. I don't think you need that unless you're going to be doing planting something that it's a very small seed, like lettuce or radishes or something like that. But in my case, because I don't do a lot of leafy greens, and when I do plant lettuces, they normally come in transplants. So they're not from the seed, they're already a pretty good size. So therefore, burning my organic matter or not passing 10 times on the same piece of land is not effective for me. I only go twice, and that's good enough for me to shape and plant. There's a little bit of there's a picture of the field with, I believe, yeah, that's Merced, right, and a few weeds at the entrance. And some years before that, we had a lots of mustard, so you can still see mustard, but the grass and the cover crop grows incredibly beautifully if you plant it at the right time. Again, always make sure that if you can, take advantage of the first rains. Normally, we get a really decent rain at the beginning of the season, and that, if you do grass, that's all it takes for it to germinate. And if you have, some sort of heavy soil like I have here, you don't have to water it until 5, 10, even sometimes 2 weeks after the first rain, if it doesn't rain much, which that's what happened in this case. Also, some of the stuff that I do between my like perennial crops like raspberries and blackberries, I always plant cover crop in between. And you can see there that we actually leave the cover crop on top. That normally helps. Number one, it controls the weeds. Number two, you keep the soil covered. So if there's a lots of wind, it's not going to be flying into your crops, and it just sometimes even helps the workers because it feels like a little cushion versus having a really hard compacted soil between the furrows. If it's between my strawberry fields, you have to be very selective on what you do. So we've done cover crop between the plastic between the beds in the furrows in past years, where we have done mustard. And then that's a little more tricky because you got to come in and kind of figure out a way to cut it with a trimmer that can only go 8 inches and not 12 inches, because then you'll damage the plastic, and then you're going to have some issues. You have a lot of grass coming out through the plastics, and then through the plastic, and then you're going to face some challenges. So you kind of have to figure things out and educate yourself, and talking to Richard Smith or somebody Laura can give you some ideas of what would work on how to trim it in a way that will not become a burden or a problem for you during the growing season.
So everything takes some creativity.
Oh, absolutely.
The third question I'm going to hold off actually until the end, because I think that it might be better to address a little bit further along after Pam has had a chance to cover some of the results from the trial itself.
Thank you, Laura and Javier. And yes, now we'll have Pam speak. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Javier. That was a great rendition of the different practices that you use and how they contribute to soil health, and why we were able to see some improvements in your soil health through the practices, through the process of the CDFA grant. So this is a particular grant that we received from CDFA, from their California Climate Initiative, which the purpose is to sequester carbon dioxide into the soils of working lands in order for California to meet its climate objectives, and at the same time It improves the health of the soils, retains water in the soils, and helps the grower too through enriching those soils and reducing the need for fertilizer and some of the inputs. So it's a win-win approach, and we're really glad that CDFA is supporting it through financing grants like this, which allow us to pay for the practices and also to hold these demonstration and outreach. So you see here in my background, one of our demonstration and outreach days when I was at Javier's ranch, and he had a strawberry U-pick, and his daughters sold the beautiful flowers that he grows there as well. So it's was a really fun place for us to work. We loved being there, and it was just an amazing experience working with Javier too, because he's just such a smart farmer and so knowledgeable, and also so innovative. So on this particular grant project, we had two different fields. We had field 1 and field 2. Field 1, as you can see in the picture here, was the much larger field of the two fields. It was about 14 acres, and field 2 was just a small 1 acre field. And we ran each of those fields a little bit differently, but they were both in close proximity to each other, both next to this, next to the creek, next to the river that's behind them, Carneros Creek, and both of them with a lot of conservation easement around them. And there were also, during the course of the project, Javier built some mounds upon which he planted hedgerows, so that hedgerows went around a good part of the field by the end of the project. He slowly did those throughout the 3 years. And then there were also some vegetated ditches. He has a pasture that's uphill of him, and he put a vegetated ditch between himself and that pasture to catch any runoff coming down so that it wouldn't get into his growing areas. The soil type that is there, as you mentioned, it's very heavy. It's a Clear Lake clay, so a strong clay soil. And we had very high starting soil organic matter. We measured each of the different plots, and the organic matter was between 4.2 and 5.9% when we first started the project. And I know that many people on our technical advisory committee came up to us and said, I don't know that you'll see much improvement because you have such a great starting place. So we were prepared for total failure, but we're very glad that didn't happen. So I want to go over our results with you. And so this is the larger field, the field 1 field. And so this field, we had we had the control field, which had Javier's practices, all the things that he went over with us earlier in the webinar, the rotation of crops, intercropping, many different kinds of crops, the cover crops, the reduced tillage. So we had the control was all the normal grower practices that Javier used. And you can see that those are the yellow box plots here. And that shows all three, each of his, on this field, each had 3 plots, and you can see the data points from each of those 3 plots. And so year 0 was before we started before we started the compost addition practice. And you could see even at that point in time, the treatment plots had a little bit higher soil organic matter in the beginning than the control plot. And that was just random circumstance. That wasn't planned on our part. Then between the year 0 and year 1, there was not that much change in the control plots. It was roughly the same, but we saw the compost plot already starting to increase in soil organic matter. And then by year 2, both the control and the compost plots were increasing. And after the 3rd edition of compost and 3rd year of grower practices, we saw even a further increase. So I just want to say that Javier purchased his farm and started to use it a couple of years before we started this experiment. And so he was new to the land at about the time we started, as well as starting the experiment at the same time. So I don't know how the previous grower farmed it, but I don't think that they use these same practices that we saw on Javier's plot as a result of Javier's practices. So I attribute these increases in soil organic matter. Both we see it went up more in the compost fields than in the grower control field, but they also went on in the control field. So that says a lot about the practices Javier used and how much those can increase soil organic matter. And in the final year, there was just an amazing, one of the plots in the compost field was above 10%, which is just a really high soil organic matter. And in fact, in every single field every single plot between year 0 and the 3rd year, we did see an increase in soil organic matter. So it really, those increases happened across the board, and to a much higher degree than we ever would have anticipated going into this. It really was pretty phenomenal. Now, this is field 2, which is the small field in the corner. And this one, we didn't see quite the same increases in soil organic matter as we did in field 1, although we did see an increase from before we started the experiment in year 0. This one, we also had a mycorrhizae addition. So we had 3 control plots, 3 mycorrhizae plots, and 3 mycorrhizae plus compost plots. And the first 2, so the first year 0 before we started these practices, and then the following year after we had incorporated these practices, we saw a big increase. And then it was kind of flat after that. So whereas in field 1, statistically, we had an increase both through time and an increase between control and compost addition, here we didn't really have a statistically significant outcome. But it was interesting that there was an increase, again, in all the plots between year 0 and year 3, so that overall there was an increase in soil organic matter through the course of the experiment. And Javier and I were talking about this yesterday and wondering, why such a difference? Those fields are right next to each other. Why in one field did we see that constant increase in soil organic matter, and in this other field right next to it we didn't? And one of the theories that we came up with is that Javier put a berm around the field to prevent flooding from the river into the field. And so what instead happened was it was on a hill slope, and instead the field flooded from above, from the hill, water coming down the hill and into the field. And in fact, it flooded so much that it took out the berm in the corner there, and the water left the field. And Javier said, maybe he lost some topsoil from that flooding. So maybe we had some of the topsoil with the organic matter leave the field during that flooding from the uphill side. So, yeah.
If I may, couple of minutes, because I also think that one we planted lettuce, fava beans, a little bit of celery, marigolds, lettuce again. So I was also thinking that the residue out of those crops was not.
Javier, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same for everyone, but I think you might be cutting off. Is that the case for? Can you hear him, Pam and Laura?
It was a little bit delayed.
Copy?
So
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
but
so
you
might.
seem to be clear at the moment, but
Okay.
check your bandwidth.
What I wanted to say is field number 1, we planted crops that are more the residue out of those, the biomass is a lot heavier because we did corn, Brussels sprouts, leeks, some squash, but I mean, and then Brussels sprouts. So I think maybe some of the organic matter on field 1 increased higher than number 1 because the biomass that we left behind, the residue, contributed to that. That's kind of what I'm thinking now. So field number 2, it was just the very light crops. The biomass wasn't as big, with the exception of adding the compost and the cover crop. But that's just a theory that I have.
And the cropping was less diverse.
Correct.
Also over the period of time. So that's very likely.
Yeah, so that's true. So both of those things all three of those things are real differences between field 1 and field 2 that also could have caused that just really escalated increase in field 1 compared to field 2. So I wanted to summarize some of the results. So the change in soil organic matter, just subtracting the beginning from the ending soil organic matter, ranged between 1.5% to 2.6% across all the different treatments and control plots in both fields. And if you look at the percent change in soil organic matter, the percent change was between 34% to 44% increase in the field. So very substantial increases in soil organic matter. The last year, we also measured bulk density in each of the plots and found a range in bulk density as well. You'll notice that it's a little bit lower in the compost addition plots than in the control plots. So that seemed to reduce bulk density, which is a good thing. And then we translated the increase to the soil organic carbon in terms of tons per acre. And we did that using the formula at the bottom where we just translated soil organic matter to soil organic carbon by dividing by 1.9. And we did there. It is possible to take measures to do that. So this is just kind of using an average that researchers have found and not from direct measures. But we use that for estimating the increase in soil organic carbon, then multiply it by bulk density and multiply that by the depth to which we took our samples, which was 8 inches, and then multiply that by unit conversions. And so that came using that equation, we came up with the tons of carbon that we added per acre to this project. So between 19.6 to 38 tons of carbon per acre added. So CDFA can be very happy that, that we accomplished their carbon sequestration objectives. And so then I took those numbers of the tons of soil organic carbon per acre, multiplied it by the acreage that we used in the field. So we had 6.5 acres in each of the trials in field 1 and 0.4 acres in field 2. And then came up with the increased carbon, the total carbon storage in those areas. And then I converted that to CO2 equivalents. And that's just basically adding the 2 oxygen molecules to the carbon molecules to come up with a CO2 equivalent. So that's our CO2 equivalent in terms of tons of carbon that we offset throughout this project, and that's over the 3-year time period, and that totaled 718 tons of carbon stored in Javier's field in 3 years. And then I looked at how does that compare to the offsets? What did California achieve in terms of its goal of carbon offsets? So the average car uses 4.6 tons per year, or produces in emissions 4.6 tons per year. So we offset 52 cars each year with the 239 tons a year that we incorporated into the soil. An average house is 7.5 tons a year, so we offset 32 houses. Californians are actually have pretty low carbon footprints, and we offset 23 Californians. And then we have these terrible forest fires, so we offset 32 acres of forest fires. So that's kind of the sad part. We did a lot of good work, but we had these terrible forest fires. So I don't know how well California is doing overall. So then we in our last technical advisory committee meeting, everyone was pretty much astounded with the results. And so the group asked me to go back and do some carbon accounting and try to find out where did our carbon increases come from. And so I did go back and do that. And I took our supplier test sheet for the compost. And each year the carbon added was a little bit different because the seed end ratio varied between about 11 and about 20. But overall, it averaged the average carbon addition, just the carbon addition, not the compost addition, but the carbon in that compost was 0.9 tons per acre. I did some residue analysis using a UC Davis study that I found, and this is just the average, as Javier mentioned. There was more addition from some crops like the Brussels sprouts than there was from crops like lettuce, but this was the average of the different crop types that we produced on those fields. So not very much, 0.07 tons per acre. The cover crop, I used some information that Eric Brennan, he was on our technical advisory committee, and he had done a study where he showed height to biomass of rye, and I converted that biomass into carbon biomass and came up with the carbon addition of almost 0.4 tons per acre. And then the thing that's left is microbial growth. And I did not know and could not find research to come up with an estimate for how fast our microbes may have grown that contributed the rest of that carbon to the soil. So that I wasn't able to estimate. And the total carbon addition into field one was, in the compost addition plot was 5.1 tons per acre, and into the control plot was 4.4 tons per acre. So I really can't account for all of that unless the microbes really took off, or unless some of field one, maybe some flooding from the nearby creek took us in a positive direction, because the berm was around the other half of the field. So maybe that flooding also could have added some carbon to the field. Some of the other soil health assessments that we did were bulk density. Bulk density was lower on the compost plots by about 5%. That increases the distance between the soil particles and allows for room for the root growth as well as oxygen to get into the soils. Another researcher working on our project did an aggregate stability test and found out that there was more aggregate stability in September, in July than in September, and they thought that might be because of the tillage that happened between those two tests. Then the other thing that we measured was yield. And so in field one, there was not enough repetition between crops because of the huge diversity in crop types there. So we couldn't really do any statistical analysis in field one, but we didn't really find that there was much difference in yield there. Sometimes the control plots were higher and sometimes the treatment plots were higher, and we couldn't really do a comparison, although we did do some measures just to see, but didn't really notice much of a difference there. I know that Javier said his tomatoes grew like crazy there last year, and I can attest to that. And not only did they grow like crazy, but they were delicious. They were just wonderful. The lettuce, we did repeat that 3 years in a row, so we were able to do a yield comparison and do statistics on that. There was no statistical difference between years or between treatments. And you can see from these bar plots the range that we found, and you can see that they're relatively flat. So I want to just touch on why these results are important to the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So why are we interested in these healthy soils projects? And we're really interested in them because really the land and the sea work together, and we have these amazing creatures that live in the sea that not many of us have access to and not many of us have a chance to know about. We have an octopus garden in the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and that left lower picture is a picture of the mothers in that octopus garden really rearing and hatching their eggs. So they protect their eggs from predators in this garden, and they're on those eggs anywhere from 1 to 3 years, protecting them from the predators. We have elephant seals and sea anemones and all kinds of whales that go through the sanctuary, and we have beautiful sea stars and just all kinds of things living here, and we want to protect those. And the issue that we have is that as there are increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the land, that causes changes in the ocean. So the ocean has absorbed a great deal of heat from the changes in the atmosphere. In fact, the ocean has absorbed about 60% of the heat that's gone into the atmosphere. So we see the ocean getting warmer, which is causing changes in currents, sea level rise, and weather extremes. And we also see chemical changes in the ocean as the carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean and causes acidification of the ocean. And that causes the shell-bearing creatures to have a hard time forming those shells because of the hydrogen, H plus molecules in the ocean. Those practices on working lands, including rangelands, that we can really make a difference, and we can really have what's called drawdown of, drawing enough carbon dioxide out of the air to really slow the rate of climate change. I'm sorry I didn't leave as much time for questions as I'd like, but let's go ahead and go back to the questions again.
Thanks, Pam. There are a couple additional questions I'd like to address. So one asks specifically about the compost, the feedstocks and seed-in ratio, application rate. And so I can speak to some of this. Pam, you might have to fill in details, but I believe we applied a green waste compost, yes, from a commercial facility. And that would have had a seed-in ratio that was greater than 11 with an application rate of 8 tons per acre. Is that all correct, Pam?
Yeah, so 5 dry tons per acre or 8 wet tons per acre. So was the addition rate, he did have a manure in his compost.
Okay,
and
so
the seed-in ratio was above 11 in all cases, and in fact ranged between, I think, just over 11 and a half to 20, depending on the year, because we added it in 3 different years. So the compost was a little bit different each year.
There's a note that it sounds as though the increase in soil organic matter is a direct measurement of the carbon dioxide sequestered, and asking if that's a fair assumption. I would say that no, that's not exactly a fair assumption. Pam used some representations of how much carbon dioxide would be effectively sequestered based on the soil organic matter increases that were observed as a way of visualizing. We also did have gas measurements in one of the fields where CSUMB researchers were evaluating greenhouse gas emissions from the fields. And we didn't share that data in this particular presentation, but that was another part of this study. We did not measure soil organic matter at depth. We only took measurements required by the Healthy Soils Project. This was partly about cost control. And so we were only measuring to 8-inch depth for soil organic matter. There's a question. Yeah.
So the big addition of soil organic matter or carbon in the soil happens is the microbes grow and die in the soil. And so long-term carbon storage occurs through these microbial processes. And it's the bodies of the microbes that are actually the long-term carbon storage. There's other kinds of carbon that cycle more rapidly and that can leave the soil more rapidly and that come and go. But it's the soil microbes, and especially as they die and leave their little microbial bodies behind, that you see true long-term carbon storage. And so we did add carbon to the soil through compost, and through the cover crops, but all the rest of that carbon increase was, I think, primarily through the microbial growth, which really is through the sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere into the soil as the plants take in the CO2, which is their method of metabolizing. They exude exudates through their roots in the form of carbohydrates that then feeds the microbes in the soil and causes those microbes to multiply, and then they multiply very quickly, and then as they die off, their bodies are left behind. So I think that there was quite a bit of carbon storage in the field through that process, because actually the compost and the cover crops and the residue only accounted for a very small part of the carbon.
So I know that we're a couple minutes past time. There are still a couple additional questions, and really they're directed toward Javier. So if we can just continue for a couple extra minutes. One is, Javier, what's your gut feeling about why wise tillage benefits soil, specifically the microbial communities, with all the talk these days about regenerative farming?
I really think that the less you disturb the soil, the healthier it is and beneficial for the plants to grow. However, the plants also require some tillage for them to do well. So the notion of maybe no-till, perhaps it's difficult to do at a larger scale. At the scale, I mean, I'm not big, but I'm a mid-sized grower. At a smaller scale, you can definitely do no-till and just keep building the horizon of organic matter by adding compost or residue. But I think the no-till thing, I think it's something kind of trendy and it sounds beautiful, but when it comes to real life and producing massive amounts of food, there's some tillage that needs to be done. We choose to do limited tillage. Normally, conventional large growers have to do really big till. So it's one of those things. I think it's just to figure out what scale we're talking about, and how much food needs to be produced to really figure out whether you want to do minimum tillage, no till, or just go right at it and rip 4 or 5 feet down. I don't know. That's one of those things that I don't think there's a right answer for. I hope I kind of answered the question, but that's just my view.
Thank you for sharing your view. There's one last question about the compost and whether you have any concerns about inert contaminants in that product, bringing it into the field, including plastics and glass.
Yes, there's always a concern, and you should be aware of that. And that concern needs to be there. That's why you need to get compost if you are not able to make it yourself, which I don't have the equipment to do it yet. And Phil Foster is too far away for me to borrow it. If I had the equipment, I would make it myself. But if I don't have it, I have to go to a company that does what they do, and they get tested in the lab and they get certified organic, and then I feel good about using their product. So you have to get it from a reliable source, not just my compadre, right? So it needs to be certified.
Thank you. That covers all of the questions that I see listed in the Q&A. So I'll hand it back to Hasmin to wrap up.
Thank you very much. And Javier, did you want to mention the upcoming event you have?
Oh, we always have events, and if there's no event, you can come and see me. We don't have to have an event. Yes, we had the Eco Farm last Saturday. This coming Friday, we have the NRCS and the American Ag Conservancy Movement. They have a partnership, and we're showing our farm on how many conservation practices we're doing. So we're inviting farmers to come and visit us. And then June 15, we are going to have a open farm for farmers in Espanol. Share some of the practices that we do and teach them a little bit of how we grow different things, strawberries and all sorts of things. And chances are we're probably going to celebrate my birthday. So you guys are welcome. Okay.
Happy early birthday. Well, thank you very much for everyone, Pam, Laura, and Javier for speaking. Again, we're celebrating the end of this project, but the beginning of additional projects that will come in the future. So thank you very much. Just a little quick note that at the end of the survey, when you close and you leave, you will be taken to a survey. So please fill that out as that informs our next events. And this event was recorded, so we'll be sharing that recording at a later time. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Erin, very, very much for providing the translation into Spanish with Global EU. So thank you very much. And we'll see you next time. Adios.